What if the story you were told about Africa was never meant to be true? What if the so-called darkness was carefully painted over something far older, deeper, and far more powerful? And what if entire belief systems were rewritten, not by accident, but by design? Tonight, this story turns its gaze toward Africa, not as a continent of mystery to be feared, but as a spiritual foundation deliberately misnamed. A land where symbols became suspects, gods were recast as demons, and ancestral wisdom was quietly pushed into the shadows. Not because it was weak, but because it was dangerous to control. This isn't a tale of myth versus history. It's about how history itself was bent, about how sacred knowledge was reframed, exported, and relabeled elsewhere, while its origin was left carrying the weight of blame. Once you see the pattern, it's hard to unsee it. What you're about to hear doesn't ask you to abandon faith or tradition. It asks you to look closer, to question why certain stories survived untouched, while others were marked as forbidden, and why Africa, of all places, carried that burden for centuries. If this kind of hidden history speaks to you, take a moment to subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These stories travel far, and they remember those who listen. They say every story has a beginning, but this one starts with an accusation hanging in the air like smoke after fire. Long before borders were drawn and doctrines were written, Africa already carried a whisper around her name, a whisper that would later harden into judgment. Funny thing is, no one can quite point to the first voice that said it out loud. It just appeared one day, repeated so often it started sounding like truth. In ancient manuscripts and medieval sermons, a quiet shift took place. What was unfamiliar became suspicious, and what was powerful became dangerous. Symbols carved in stone and sung into memory were suddenly recast as warnings, not wisdom. And just like that, the sacred began to feel threatening to those who didn't hold its keys. There's an old irony here, the kind history loves to hide behind polite language. The same civilizations that borrowed African knowledge, astronomy, medicine, spiritual lore, later flinched at its source. They took what they needed, then dimmed the light behind them, calling the darkness proof of corruption. Strange how that works, right? Across deserts and forests, drums still echoed stories of balance, ancestors, and cosmic order. Yet elsewhere, those echoes were twisted into something else entirely. The conflict wasn't fought with swords at first, but with words, translations, and carefully chosen silences that reshaped meaning without leaving fingerprints. And so the stage was set, not for conquest yet, but for permission. Because once a land is labeled as something to fear, everything that follows feels justified. But this was only the opening move, a subtle turn of the narrative wheel. And deeper layers were already waiting beneath the surface. The next layer unfolded quietly, almost politely, as symbols began to change their faces. Marks once etched to honor cycles of life and death were redrawn in foreign ink, stripped of their original breath. A spiral that spoke of eternity suddenly meant chaos. A mask meant to heal was reimagined as something meant to haunt. Funny how a line or two can flip meaning upside down. In sacred African spaces, symbols were never decoration. They were contracts with the unseen, visual prayers, living language. Each curve, each color carried memory and instruction. But when outsiders arrived without the stories, they saw only shapes and filled the silence with their own fears. There's an old pattern here, easy to miss if you're not looking closely. When power doesn't understand something, it reframes it. Slowly, patiently, until repetition does the heavy lifting. Over time, the new meaning sticks, while the old one fades into whispers shared only at night. As these altered symbols spread through books, churches, and later classrooms, they began to feel official. Authority has a way of sounding convincing, especially when spoken loudly and often enough. The original voices weren't erased in one stroke. They were simply drowned out. Yet symbols have long memories. Even when misnamed, they continue to work beneath the surface, waiting for the moment someone looks twice and feels something stir. And that stirring leads inevitably to the next question. What kind of world existed before the symbols were broken apart? Long before the labels and distortions took hold, Africa moved to a very different rhythm. Cities rose with purpose, trade routes pulsed with life, and knowledge flowed like a river across deserts and seas. From the Nile Valley to the Sahel, societies organized themselves around law, memory, and cosmic order. This wasn't chaos, it was structure, lived and practiced. Stone, earth, and wood became archives. Temples aligned with stars, calendars followed celestial cycles, and oral historians carried timelines longer than most written records. It's almost ironic how often this sophistication gets called lost, when the truth is, it was deliberately overlooked. Spiritual life wasn't separated from daily life, it was woven into it. Governance, justice, agriculture, and healing all answered to a sacred logic. The idea that faith and reason were opposites simply didn't exist here. That division would come later, imported like a foreign disease. When travelers from other lands passed through, they didn't arrive empty-handed. They took notes, learned methods, absorbed philosophies. Some even wrote about it openly, praising African centers of learning. Those accounts still exist, though they're rarely the ones highlighted, and that selective memory opened another door. Because once a civilization's depth is ignored, it becomes easier to rewrite its origins. And behind those origins, a deeper spiritual framework waits, one that shaped gods, myths, and meanings still echoing ahead. In those early ages, the sacred wasn't distant or unreachable. It breathed through wind, soil, blood, and breath. African cosmologies spoke of a universe held together by balance, where visible and invisible worlds touched constantly. Divinity didn't rule from above. It circulated, moved, and responded. Deities emerged not as tyrants, but as principles, justice walking on two legs, fertility carried in rain, wisdom hidden in crossroads. Ancestors weren't gone, they were present, advising, correcting, protecting. That idea alone unsettled later belief systems that preferred strict hierarchies between heaven and earth. There's a quiet irony in how these concepts traveled. Elements of African spiritual order appear echoed elsewhere. Moral law, sacred breath, divine word, yet stripped of their original names. Same rhythm, different drum, and somehow the source became invisible. Rituals served as moments of alignment, not submission. Through dance, chant, and offering, communities remembered who they were and how they fit into the larger pattern. These weren't acts of fear, but of participation in something vast and alive. But balance attracts attention, and attention, when mixed with ambition, often leads to disruption. As these spiritual systems endured, pressure began to mount from forces that saw order not as harmony, but as something to control. Pressure didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, carried by unfamiliar words and unfamiliar gods, wrapped in promises of salvation and progress. What had once been understood as living wisdom was suddenly framed as something unfinished, something that needed correction. And correction, as history loves to remind us, is often the polite face of erasure. Sacred spaces became contested ground. Shrines were questioned, rituals mocked, and ancestral knowledge reduced to superstition. The conflict wasn't just physical or political. It cut through the spiritual spine of entire peoples. To doubt one's gods is to doubt one's own origin. There's an uncomfortable truth hiding here. To dominate a land, it's not enough to control its bodies. Its spirit must be weakened first. And so, stories were retold with a twist, translations bent just enough to change meaning, turning guardians into threats and wisdom into temptation. Yet even under pressure, the old ways adapted. Symbols hid inside songs, rituals survived in coded gestures, and ancestral names slipped quietly into new prayers. Survival became an art form, subtle and resilient, passed down without ever asking permission. This tension between what was lived and what was imposed didn't fade away. It hardened, and as the spiritual struggle deepened, it prepared the ground for something far more deliberate, far more calculated, waiting just beyond the horizon. What followed wasn't confusion, it was strategy. At a certain point, misunderstanding turned into design. Narratives were sharpened, not softened, and a convenient conclusion began to circulate. If domination felt wrong, it could be made right by declaring the dominated spiritually dangerous. Moral discomfort dissolved once fear took its place. Masks, once carved to channel protection, were suddenly described as faces of evil. Drums that marked seasons and ceremonies were accused of summoning darkness. The irony is sharp enough to cut. Sound, rhythm, and image were never the problem. Control was. And labeling them as evil solved that problem neatly. This shift didn't happen in isolation. It traveled through sermons, travel logs, and early academic texts, repeating itself until it felt unquestionable. Say something often enough, dress it in authority, and soon it stops sounding like an opinion. It becomes common sense. And here's the part rarely said out loud. By turning African spirituality into a threat, violence gained spiritual permission. Chains felt lighter when the soul of the captive was declared already lost. History didn't just look away, it nodded. But every constructed lie leaves cracks. And through those cracks, fragments of truth slipped forward, hidden in parallel traditions, half-remembered symbols, and stories that refused to die quietly. Those fragments would soon begin to connect in ways few expected. As the story spread, it began to mirror itself across distant lands. Ideas born in Africa resurfaced elsewhere, wearing new names, new robes, and new authorities. Creation myths, sacred floods, divine laws etched into stone. The patterns were familiar, almost too familiar. Coincidence, they said. Borrowing, they insisted. But the silence around origin spoke louder than explanations. In ancient Egypt, long tied to the African continent despite later attempts to detach it, concepts of judgment, afterlife, and moral balance were already established. Maat weighed the heart long before similar imagery appeared in later scriptures. Funny how timelines get blurry when acknowledgement becomes inconvenient. Across Mesopotamia and into biblical texts, echoes continued. Sacred breath, the spoken word that creates reality, the idea of a chosen people guided by divine law. These themes didn't appear from nowhere. They traveled, transformed, and were selectively remembered. Same bones, different flesh. What made these connections forbidden wasn't their existence, but their implication. If Africa was foundational, then the narrative of spiritual superiority collapses, and that's a hard pill to swallow for histories built on hierarchy. So the links were softened, then dismissed, then quietly buried under layers of interpretation. But buried things don't vanish, they wait. And the deeper one digs, the clearer it becomes that this web of connections is only beginning to reveal itself. As these connections lingered in the background, another tension rose to the surface. Fear of what knowledge could do if left uncontrolled. African systems didn't separate spirit from science, and that blend unsettled outside observers. Astronomy guided planting, medicine followed ritual, and ethics shaped leadership. Power rooted in understanding is hard to dominate. Healers knew plants that modern laboratories would later discover. Star readers mapped skies with precision passed down through generations. None of this fit the story of primitivism that had already been sold. So the knowledge itself became suspicious, quietly reframed as dangerous or heretical. There's an irony history rarely admits. When knowledge can't be owned, it gets outlawed. What couldn't be extracted or patented was instead forbidden, dismissed as myth while being studied in secret, publicly mocked, privately borrowed. This fear hardened into policy. Schools replaced shrines, foreign doctrines replaced ancestral instruction, and memory was interrupted on purpose. A people disconnected from their knowledge become easier to manage, easier to reshape. Yet suppression never fully works. Knowledge adapts, hides, and waits for conditions to change. And as these ancient systems slipped underground, they carried something else with them, a quiet resistance that would surface in unexpected ways. That resistance didn't always look like rebellion. Sometimes it looked like silence, other times like song. In places where open practice became dangerous, traditions slipped into rhythm, coded language, and gesture. What couldn't be spoken directly learned how to dance, hum, and whisper its way through generations. Across the Atlantic, fragments of African spirituality crossed oceans in memory rather than books. Names changed, forms shifted, but the core endured. Drums spoke where words were forbidden, and rituals survived disguised as folklore. Survival itself became sacred work. Ironically, these traditions were labeled dark, even as they healed bodies, preserved identity, and rebuilt community under crushing conditions. The same practices that offered strength were framed as proof of corruption. It was a convenient contradiction, one that few bothered to question. Yet even under constant pressure, something remarkable happened. The more these traditions were pushed into the shadows, the more resilient they became. What was hidden grew roots, spreading quietly beneath the surface. And those roots would not remain unseen forever, because when memory survives long enough, it eventually demands recognition, and the world, whether ready or not, begins to feel its presence again. As centuries turned, the story hardened into something official. Textbooks, pulpits, and policies began echoing the same undertone. Africa as absence, as lack, as problem. Repetition did what force alone never could. Over time, distortion stopped looking like distortion and started sounding like fact. This wasn't just history being written, it was identity being edited. Generations grew up learning about themselves through someone else's lens, one that filtered out complexity and left behind caricature. And when a people are taught to doubt their own beginnings, control becomes almost effortless. The real damage wasn't only external, it settled inside minds, reshaping self-perception, faith, and worth. Spiritual inheritance turned into something to hide, something to apologize for. The quiet violence of that shift still lingers today. Yet even here, the irony persists. While official narratives dismissed African contributions, the modern world continued using them, from agricultural systems to ethical frameworks, without acknowledgement. Erasure and dependence side by side. That tension, unresolved and growing, set the stage for a reckoning. Because when suppressed history meets modern curiosity, questions start breaking through the surface, and those questions lead straight into discoveries many were never meant to see. When curiosity finally pushed past permission, the ground began to give way. Archaeological sites long ignored started speaking again. Stone circles aligned with solstices, cities planned with mathematical precision, symbols repeating across continents. Funny how the earth remembers even when books pretend to forget. Ancient manuscripts resurfaced in fragments, often mislabeled or tucked away in archives few could access. Some were written in Ge'ez, others carried in Arabic accounts, describing African centers of learning with admiration. The evidence was never missing, it was just inconvenient. Oral histories, once dismissed as unreliable, suddenly aligned with physical findings. Timelines matched, names echoed. What elders had preserved through memory alone began to line up with carbon dating and satellite imagery. That moment, when science catches up with tradition, tends to make people uncomfortable. Still, acceptance didn't come easily. Each discovery was explained away, minimized, or detached from its African context. Credit drifted elsewhere, as it often does. A familiar pattern repeating itself with modern tools. But something had shifted. Once the door cracked open, it refused to close again. And with each new finding, a deeper question emerged. If so much was hidden, what else had been deliberately left beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise? As these findings seeped into public awareness, their impact traveled far beyond museums and universities. In streets, classrooms, and sacred spaces, people began reconnecting dots that had been scattered on purpose. Identity, once fractured, started feeling whole again, not loud, not aggressive, just grounded. For many across the diaspora, this reconnection felt less like learning something new and more like remembering. Symbols once feared now felt familiar. Practices once avoided began to make sense. It wasn't a rejection of modern faiths or systems, but an expansion, a widening of the lens. Of course, not everyone welcomed this shift. Old narratives don't give up easily. When history props up power, challenging it can feel threatening. So the conversation was often dismissed as revisionism or worse, romanticism, an easy label to avoid harder truths. Yet the movement kept growing, fueled by art, music, scholarship, and quiet personal awakenings. What had survived in fragments now sought coherence, and with coherence came confidence, the kind that doesn't need permission. This return to memory didn't promise closure, it opened doors instead. Because once people reclaim their past, they start asking sharper questions about the present. And those questions, inevitably, point toward forces still shaping the world today. That questioning reached into places far beyond history books. Politics, religion, and global power structures all carry fingerprints from those older distortions. Ideas about who leads, who follows, who is civilized, and who needs saving didn't appear by accident. They were inherited, polished, and passed along. Spiritual language still gets used as a tool. Nations are framed as righteous, others as chaotic. Cultures are praised or feared depending on how closely they align with inherited narratives. The irony lingers. The same continent once branded as spiritually dangerous is constantly mined for inspiration, rhythm, and soul. In everyday life, the echoes are subtle but persistent. Beauty standards, religious imagery, even the way good and evil are visually coded often trace back to those early distortions. Most people never stop to ask why. They just absorb it, like background noise. Yet awareness has a way of changing how sound is heard. Once the pattern is noticed, it can't be unseen. What felt normal begins to feel constructed, and construction implies builders and intentions. That realization doesn't bring comfort, it brings responsibility. Because if the present still carries the weight of an altered past, then understanding that past becomes more than curiosity. It becomes a key. And keys, once found, tend to unlock more than one door. With that responsibility comes a quiet shift in how truth is handled. No longer something handed down unquestioned, it becomes something felt, tested, reclaimed. Across Africa and its diaspora, symbols once stripped of meaning are being re-examined, not as relics, but as living codes. What was once dismissed as folklore reveals layered philosophies about balance, community, and continuity. Names regain pronunciation, rituals regain context, and silence gives way to careful listening. It's not about going backward, it's about recovering what was paused. There's a subtle irony here too. The same global systems that once worked to erase these traditions now watch them re-emerge through digital archives, independent research, and shared memory. Control slips when access widens. Knowledge has a way of finding cracks. This return doesn't arrive with certainty, it arrives with curiosity. Questions replace shame, respect replaces fear. And in that shift, something powerful happens. Identity stops asking for validation. Still, this is not an ending. Reclamation always reveals deeper layers beneath the first discovery. And as symbols come back into focus, they point towards something even older, something buried beneath time itself, waiting for the next veil to lift. Beneath those layers lies a realization that unsettles and steadies at the same time. The story was never really about good versus evil. It was about control versus balance. Once that clicks, a lot of inherited fear starts to feel manufactured, almost scripted. African spiritual systems didn't promise domination or salvation through conquest. They spoke of responsibility, reciprocity, and consequence. Power wasn't granted. It was earned through alignment with community and cosmos. That idea alone challenged empires built on hierarchy. So the mislabeling did its job well. By framing balance as danger, domination could pass as order. By calling ancestral memory dark, forgetfulness could be sold as progress. It's a clever trick, one that worked for centuries precisely because it felt normal. But normal starts to crack when people notice how much effort went into maintaining the illusion. Laws, doctrines, aesthetics, even language bent in the same direction. That kind of consistency doesn't happen by chance. It happens by design. And once design is recognized, choice returns. Because understanding how a story was built opens space to imagine how it might be retold. And that retelling, still unfinished, begins where the oldest memories quietly wait to be heard again. Time, oddly enough, has become an ally in that retelling. What once needed force to suppress now struggles to survive under scrutiny. Archives open, elders speak, scholars compare notes across continents. The story starts correcting itself, not loudly, but steadily. There's a sensory shift that comes with this moment. Old chants resurface in modern voices. The smell of incense returns to spaces once stripped bare. Symbols reappear in art and skin. None of it feels random. It feels remembered, as if something long asleep is stretching. This awakening doesn't ask everyone to believe the same thing. It asks something quieter, more unsettling, to reconsider what was taught as obvious, to notice how often evil was assigned without evidence, and how rarely that assignment was questioned. Some resist, of course. Myths of superiority don't dissolve easily. They cling, adapt, rebrand, but their grip weakens each time a suppressed truth is spoken without apology. Exposure does what confrontation often can't. And so the movement continues, not as a rebellion, but as a restoration. Yet even now, the work feels incomplete, because behind restored memory lies an even deeper inheritance, one that predates distortion itself, waiting patiently for the final veil to fall. That deeper inheritance doesn't announce itself loudly. It hums beneath language, beneath borders, beneath time. It lives in the idea that Africa was never a footnote in human history, but a foundation, inconvenient, undeniable, and quietly resilient. When this truth surfaces, it reframes everything. The question stops being why Africa was linked to evil and becomes why such effort was required to make that lie stick. Lies don't need maintenance unless the truth keeps pressing back. There's a strange calm in realizing this. Not anger, not vengeance. Clarity, the kind that strips fear of its costume. Once the mask falls, what remains isn't darkness, but depth. Complexity mistaken for threat. This clarity doesn't erase pain or history. It contextualizes it. It shows how distortion functioned, how belief was engineered, and how survival became its own form of wisdom. That awareness alone shifts power. And still, the story doesn't close here, because understanding the mechanism of erasure is only one step. What comes next is choice, how this reclaimed memory will shape the future. And that future, like the past, is still being written. What comes next feels less like discovery and more like responsibility. Once memory is reclaimed, it asks to be carried with care. Not weaponized, not romanticized, but honored as something alive. Africa's legacy isn't frozen in the past. It breathes through present choices. Across communities, this remembrance begins shaping new conversations about faith, power, and belonging. People start questioning inherited fears, noticing how often they were taught what to reject before they were allowed to understand. That realization lands quietly, but it lands deep. There's an old ancestral idea that truth doesn't rush. It reveals itself when the listener is ready. And perhaps that's why this knowledge survived at all. Hidden in plain sight, protected by time until ears and hearts could receive it without distortion. This moment isn't about replacing one narrative with another. It's about restoring balance to a story that leaned too far in one direction. Balance, after all, has always been at the core of African spiritual thought. And as this balance begins to return, it opens one final threshold, because behind reclaimed identity lies an even greater question. What happens when a civilization remembers not just who it was, but who it was always meant to become? What remains after a revelation like this isn't certainty, it's reverence. A quiet understanding that Africa's spiritual legacy was never destroyed, only buried beneath layers of fear, misnaming, and deliberate forgetting. And buried things, as history keeps proving, have a way of returning. The sands of time still cover temples, texts, and truths not yet uncovered. Beneath them sleep stories that don't ask to dominate, only to be remembered. Stories that speak of balance instead of conquest, of ancestry instead of erasure, of wisdom earned through continuity rather than force. This history doesn't end here. It breathes through those who choose to listen, to question, to honor what came before without distortion. Each rediscovered symbol, each restored name, pulls another thread from the veil that once hid an entire civilization's light. If this story stirred something in you, stay with us. Subscribe, activate notifications, and walk with us as more forgotten truths rise from the silence. The past is not finished speaking, and many mysteries still sleep beneath the dust of time.